Welcome to the webinar Model of Kidney Exchange and Change. This is part of the pre-Congress webinar series of the ESOT 2021 meeting that will be held in Milan at the end of next August. And it is my pleasure to introduce Lisa Barnett. She is consultant leading nurse at NHS Blood and Transplant in UK. And she will talk us of the kidney exchange in UK, which is one of the most successful programs in Europe. Lisa, please.
Thank you, Franco, for the introduction, and to you and Nizam and to ESOT for inviting me to give this talk today. It's a great pleasure to be part of this webinar. So I'm going to speak to you about what we call the UK Living Kidney Sharing Scheme in the UK. So of course, like most other countries, we started this scheme because approximately 23% of our living donor recipient pairs were incompatible, either by blood group or HLA, inducing a positive cross match. And so this was at the time, this accounted for between 100 and 150 of our potential living donor recipients in the UK programme. So the background to the scheme was that there was a change in the legal framework in September 2006, which allowed us to develop a framework around kidney paired exchange and non-directed or unspecified donation. And that first started in April 2007, has been ongoing ever since, and has been almost like a continuous improvement programme. And of note, we were very grateful to our colleagues from the University of Glasgow, David Manlove and his team, for helping us to develop the actual matching algorithm that supports the scheme. So the scheme today looks like this. In 2007, we first identified our first exchanges were between two couples in what we call paired exchange. And in 2008, a year later, we introduced a third pair into that scheme called pooled donation. In 2012 and 2015, we offered our non-directed altruistic kidney donors the opportunity to go into this scheme and initiate a chain of transplants, either with one pair or two pairs in the middle, and concluding and completing with the patient on the waiting list. Due to the success of this, in 2018, we made this position the default position, and I'll talk to you a little more about that in a moment. So we have approximately 250 to 300 pairs in every quarterly matching run, and this results in a rather attractive diagram that looks like that, but is extremely complicated. And we seek to maximise the number of transplants that we can achieve according to criteria that were agreed with the clinical community, in fact, when the scheme was originally set up. So the key difference perhaps between the UK scheme and other schemes is that one of the things that we aim to do is to maximise the number of transplants by embedding possible alternative exchanges should a pair fall out. So for example, we maximise the number of three-way exchanges we identify with an embedded two-way in. You can read the rest of the criteria there on the slide, but by minimising certain combinations of exchanges and having a score-based system is the way in which the rest of the scheme works. But the key difference is this embedded chain or pairs that we can default to. So the key characteristics of the programme are that it's a UK-wide scheme that goes across all 4 nations, and 23 adult transplant centres are involved, together with those that have accompanying children's transplant centres. The workup for all donors and recipient pairs has to be complete. Recipients can go in with more than one donor, and we include incompatible and compatible pairs in the scheme. Age and HLA match requirements can be defined on registration, and we also permit simple desensitisation scenarios through the scheme to facilitate less complicated transplants for individuals. We prefer simultaneous surgery for all donors. The kidneys travel, but we do also default to non-simultaneous surgery as required, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Anonymity is required between all donors and recipients prior to surgery, but can be broken at any time afterwards by mutual consent. And as I have already said, we run to an annual timetable which is set in advance, which is works on quarterly matching runs. Another key difference in the kidney sharing scheme in the UK is that we run a pre-run to confirm potential matches might be acceptable to individual centres. So this identifies all the potential donors that may be matched to a particular recipient, and centres are given an opportunity to decline or accept those potential offers. And this minimises the risk of late declines. Our priorities over the years have been to maximise transplants by increasing the donor pool, providing as much flexibility as possible in the scheme, and tackling transplants that don't proceed, as well as improving the access and awareness for our patients and our clinical colleagues. So these are the mechanisms by which we've increased the donor pool: the inclusion of non-directed donors as a default, the inclusion of compatible pairs and encouragement of people to put in compatible pairs in the scheme, and low risk desensitization. Just to focus on a couple of these, our non-directed altruistic kidney donors, we have approximately 100 a year with some variation, and over the course of the scheme we've increased the proportion that go in such that we have generated a considerable number of transplants in addition and over and above the number of donors that actually go in the scheme as a result of that. The inclusion of compatible pairs is a very interesting one. Initially, the uptake of this was very low. It has begun to increase, and you can see there in the grey that every centre now does include compatible pairs. And indeed, of 112 compatible pairs that have been registered in the scheme by 2019, 259 transplants have been generated. And most of these compatible pairs achieve a transplant on the first or second run. By increasing flexibility in the scheme in the ways that I have suggested is by recipients can request age and HLA preferences at inclusion, and that reduces the risk of late declines. We have a designated time frame for surgery of matched transplants across all centres, ideally before the inclusion in the next matching run, and this reduces the risk of non-participation and non-proceeding transplants. Non-simultaneous surgery, where it allows multiple matches to go ahead, is low risk if the reasons are for logistical and non-clinical reasons, and reduces delay in the scheme, which is actually our worst enemy in terms of transplants being unable to proceed. And we have got a system of reciprocity for our recipients should their paired donor donate in the scheme and they do not receive a transplant for any other reason. Fortunately, this is a rare occurrence, but it is helpful. We monitor performance very closely on a centre-specific basis. This is done by SurveyMonkey. Every collapsed exchange is monitored, followed up with the individual centre, and an improvement plan in place if it could have been a foreseen problem. Improving access and awareness has been an important part of our programme, particularly the engagement from our patients and public, and in terms of professional decision-making and learning. This is some examples of how we've increased media presence and educational resources for our patients, and for our professional colleagues. We have a number of resources that we home on our website, which now enables them and facilitates them with the scheme. So the impact on all of this has been such that we now have what was recognised as the largest and most innovative scheme in Europe a few years ago when we did a survey as part of the European Network for Collaboration on Kidney Exchange Programmes. At a local level, we have seen a persistently high number of donor and recipient pairs going into the scheme. We have seen an impact with COVID, obviously, in this last year, but you can see the proportion of transplants that proceed in blue is high, that the proportion of non-directed donors going into chains has increased, that the combinations of transplants in three-way and long chains has increased over the years, and the proportion of non-proceeding transplants has been significantly reduced. So this is what our activity in the scheme looks like. Obviously, it was reduced by 50% during COVID years, and only 2 of our matching runs actually went ahead. But nonetheless, we still achieved 500 transplants last year, which was an enormous success. And you can see those in the grey and the black there represent those that are achieved through our kidney sharing scheme. This has had a dramatic impact on the requirement for antibody incompatible transplantation in both our adults and our paediatrics. And in terms of ethnicity, there's about 20 to 30% of children and 20% of adults are transplanted through the schemes. You can see on the left-hand side there of the charts. And that is a significant benefit that we hadn't anticipated, and this is regardless of the ethnicity of their donor. In terms of graft survival, extremely good outcomes there. And as you can see, the key message from this is all are better than HLA incompatible transplants. We have some challenges. The scheme is large, it is paper-based, and we need some digitization to sit behind it. And as a result, we have had a couple of critical incidents, which we are now managing. We had some suspensions of the scheme last year, and delay due to collapsed exchanges and non-proceeding transplants remains a challenge but we are managing to achieve greater than 75% conversion rate of identified transplants in the scheme now. And just very briefly, the next revolution, our next strategy includes more of the same, but in particular, underpinning the manual processes in the scheme so that we can develop with our colleagues in Glasgow the algorithm to create more opportunities for our patients. So in summary, the scheme has revolutionised the approach to antibody incompatible transplantation in the UK. It is the largest scheme in Europe and has I believe, an international reputation now, and it continues to evolve and develop, but we have a lot more work to do, with an enormous thanks to a huge team of people, which this slide hardly reflects, but thank you for listening.
Lisa, thank you very much for an excellent talk as ever, and for keeping to time. So just for the attendees, my name's Nizam Mamode. I'm a professor of transplant surgery at Guy's in London. Can I encourage you to use the question and answer button, Q&A button, which is on the bottom of your screen on the right-hand side, and type in your questions. We're going to deal with all of the questions at the end, so please type them in as you go along. It's my pleasure to introduce Peter Biro, who's got a PhD in maths and computer science from Budapest University, and he's going to talk about kidney exchanges in the European Union. So Peter, thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me as well. So actually my first experience in practice for kidney exchange was indeed in the UK, in the Glasgow group. Together with David Mellov, we developed this algorithm for UK kidney exchange scheme. So it's really a pleasure personally also for me to see that how successful this scheme is after 14 years. Okay, so I hope you can see my screen. So please interrupt me if there is any technical problem, but I am hoping that you can all see my screen and hear my voice. Okay, so I'm speaking on behalf of this coast action that we just finished this year. And actually, I would like to shortly introduce this coast action to you. And speak about the two handbooks that we published based on two surveys conducted with the colleagues from almost 28 countries in Europe. So this was by Working Group 1, which we led together with Bernadette Hazel. Now, after that, I will briefly speak about the development that Working Group 3 did for a simulator conducting policy studies for international kidney exchange programs. This simulator is going to be used for evaluating Scandia transplant in the near future. And actually, in the end of my talk, I will briefly mention also a new grant that we just received, which can hopefully help to develop software that can be used everywhere in Europe. Okay, so as Lisa already introduce this idea of kidney exchange. I'm just having a reminding slide. So this is a pairwise exchange, this is a three-way exchange, and that is an altruistic chain. Actually, in some countries, like in Italy, deceased donors are also used to trigger chains. So the coast action on the European Network for Collaboration on Kidney Exchange Programs started in 2016, November, and we just completed it this March. So first Joris van der Kloeder was the chair, and then David Menlo took over. So in this coast action, we really had a nice group of people from Europe. So from each country, we had at least 2 members from all communities. So we really achieved the original plan to have both, medical experts, including, surgeons, coordinators, nephrologists, and other experts. And on the other hand, we also had, computer scientists, optimization people, economists. So we had really a good network, and essentially we managed to achieve these goals, to understand what are the best practices, what are the current practices in Europe, and then also we developed a kind of prototype for international kidney exchange programs. So, as I already mentioned, the goal of Working Group 1 was to do a survey with a data collection summarizing the best practices in Europe. And indeed, as Lisa mentioned already, so here are the colleagues from the countries who filled the survey form. So you can read the details in this publication, Transplantation. So the main finding was that there already in 2017, there were at least 10 European countries having some kind of kidney exchange program. The largest ones are the UK program, the Dutch program, and the Spanish program. So the Dutch program was the first, started in 2004. But actually, regarding the number of transplants, so the overall number, UK is the largest program, and the Dutch program used to be the second in the overall number of transplants until 2016. But if we just consider a recent year, now actually the Spanish program became the second largest. All the other programs are relatively small, and one of the main questions we discussed is, how to help these programs to further develop. And so in the second handbook, actually, we did a survey focusing on the optimization aspects. So what are the goals of the decision makers in a matching run? So this was summarized in another scientific paper at the European Journal for Operational Research. So as Lisa already mentioned, what is the UK optimization policy? So in Europe, we see similar policies. The main objective is to maximize the number of transplants, but there are also many other factors, also quality factors like HLA matching, in particular DR antigen matching, and minimization of age differences and other factors that can lead to better results in terms of graft survival times. But there are also many other factors regarding, simplicity of logistics, and having short cycles can also help to actually get those transplants done, because as Lisa also mentioned, unfortunately, the identified transplants can also be cancelled by various reasons. So, so if you are interested, I am referring to this usual paper for the details. Now, one very important point, which is also the topic of this webinar today, is the possibility of enlarging the programs and joining the programs in Europe. And the first case for an organized international exchange in Europe was conducted between the two centers of Vienna and Prague. And since then, there have been several collaborations. So as you probably all know, this is the transplant sharing. We have Eurotransplant, Scandia Transplant, South Transplantarians, which are the three main international alliances. However, only Scandia Transplant decided to run a kidney exchange program since 2 years ago. And actually, we are in contact with them. We will investigate their optimization policies. Regarding the others, the program of Spain, Portugal, and Italy is quite interesting. They are doing a more conservative collaboration because first they run the national matchings, and only the remaining patient donor pairs are considered for international cycles. So we see different policies, different approaches, but the main point is that there are several initiatives now in Europe. And actually Working Group 3 was responsible for this topic of transnational kidney exchange programs. And together with many colleagues, especially from Porto, Cecilia Pimentova was the leader of this working group. And they already had a nice software tool, which was previously used by the Portuguese program. Now we use this software tool and further developed with colleagues in Budapest and Glasgow. And the idea is to simulate international kidney exchange programs. So this is just a snapshot of how this software is working. So we need to, have a standardized input from the countries. And in this software, we can actually replace and complete the input. So if some countries would like to investigate how a merge program would perform, they can share their historical data set, and the simulator can merge these data from different countries. If needed, we can also extend a bit this data and then create the so-called virtual cross-match graph that Lisa also mentioned, where we see the potential transplants. And sometimes the scores are also computed regarding the optimization factors like HLA matching values. We can also just do everything by generating such graphs using the distributional parameters of the national pools, and therefore we can also conduct simulations without real data actually. And after that, we can plug in all these optimization policies that I mentioned that we surveyed in Europe. We had like 20 different optimization goals considered. So all of them can be used. And finally, we can run, a long-term simulation where failures can also happen. Okay, I just wanted to finally mention that now we have an ongoing collaboration with the Scandia Transplant. So we are going to investigate their historical data set, and so they are just about to change their policy rules. So currently Denmark and Sweden are collaborating, but Norway and Finland are just about to join. So they would like to revise their policies. So these are the new optimization factors considered, but the old ones are the usual ones, like maximizing the number of transplants, minimizing the number of ABO incompatible transplants, and finally having short cycles. Okay, and this is my last slide. I just wanted to mention that a few weeks ago we got the new, good news that this grant application was accepted. So this will be led again by David Melov and Anna Vienna. So the cost action can continue the work, and the goal is to develop a software for international kidney exchange program that can be used everywhere in Europe by the national transplant organizations. And we really hope that this can also facilitate further interactions and further collaborations between European countries. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Peter, for your excellent presentation. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Michael Rees. Michael Rees is a renal transplant surgeon working in Toledo, Ohio, and is leading one of the most successful paired kidney exchange program in US, and will talk to us of kidney exchange in the United States.
Thank you, Franco. Let me share my screen here. There we go. So I have a couple of conflicts of interest to share. I serve as the unpaid CEO of the Alliance for Paired Kidney Donation. I'm a board member and equity holder of Rejuvenate Healthcare. I'd especially like to thank Franco Citterio for inviting me, and along with the conference organizers, for the opportunity to speak to you today about kidney exchange in the United States. So unlike what the UK has been able to do, we have not been able to get everybody in the United States to work together for a single national program. And while I think that not having a single pool limits the total number of transplants that we can achieve, one of the good things that's come out of it is it has allowed the United States really to be an innovation incubator. And most of the innovations in the field of kidney exchange have come from the United States. As you can see here, we have, these are just 10 of the different kidney exchange programs. There's still many transplant centers that have single center kidney exchange programs. But by having many different competing kidney exchange programs, we've been able to lead a number of innovations. So it was Felix Rappaport who first came up with the idea of kidney exchange in 1986. We had to then build software to let transplant centers work together. Bob Montgomery, Dori Segev, Lloyd Ratner, Frank Delmonico, Al Roth, and colleagues all came up with different ways of expanding to do three-way exchanges instead of just two-way exchanges, to incorporate non-directed donors first simultaneously, and then together with the Alliance for Paired Kidney Donation. It was done for the first time in 2007 non-simultaneously, and the longest chain is now transplanted more than 50 people because of one non-directed donor. We now routinely ship kidneys. We've let donors donate before recipients have received. We've recognized that there are oftentimes different payers. We particularly saw this when we did the first international exchange between Greece and the United States. And when you have different payers, you've got to figure out how to finance things. So we built a standard acquisition charge. And in the process of that, recognized that there's so much savings from avoiding dialysis that that high-income countries could actually afford to pay for 2 kidney transplants, because the cost of transplantation is about 1/3 of the cost of dialysis over 3 to 5 years. Other innovative ideas are the idea that instead of just a living non-directed donor starting a chain, maybe a deceased donor could start a chain, something called community-directed donation that I won't be able to get into today. The National Kidney Registry has really pushed forward with Jeff Veal and some of the ideas that he and Garrett have brought to life with the advanced donation program and vouchers for non-directed donors that we're now adopting in the APKD, and donor protection programs to try to make it so that the act of living kidney donation is truly financially neutral. While there's been a great deal of innovation, there has also that doesn't mean that we haven't been able to achieve a large number of kidney transplants in the United States. And so, as you can see in this slide, in 2019, we did more than 1,100 kidney paired exchange transplants in the United States. And as a percentage of the total living donor kidney transplants in the United States, it was 22% in 2020. So kidney paired donation now produces more than 20% of all the living donor kidney transplants in the United States. But today I'd like to focus on how kidney exchange has really, how innovation in kidney exchange has been driven, and my best experiences through the Alliance for Paired Kidney Donation, which is the organization that I helped to found in 2006, and which, as you can see in the slide, has helped lead a lot of that innovation. All of the bolded areas here are areas where the APKD has helped lead the innovation. But today I only have 12 minutes, so I'm going to focus my energy on telling you about 2 innovations that are currently ongoing. All of the innovations that you see here have been controversial. They all have some ethical challenges, and doing something in a non-simultaneous fashion, giving a non-directed donor kidney to somebody in the middle of the waiting list instead of the person at the top of the waiting list. They all have ethical challenges. And so I'm going to get into those a little bit, but fortunately right after me, we'll get to hear from Frederike Ambagtsheer about how the ESOT ELPAT committee has thought about some of these things. So let's start with deceased donors. Deceased donors, really, if you think of them, a deceased donor is really an altruistic donor, not a lot different in terms of trying to help a stranger than a non-directed living donor. And yet we have a lot of control over what we do with deceased donor kidneys at the national level, whereas there's not as much control exerted over what's done with a living non-directed donor kidney. So that gave the Alliance for Paired Kidney Donation the opportunity to create the first non-simultaneous extended altruistic donor chain, or need chain. And I'm going to get into the ethics and the challenges of that. So when we first thought about taking an altruistic donor kidney and how to allocate it, and I talked with my colleagues in the United States, they all said that what we should do, you see here the altruistic donor, here's the waiting list, here's the person at the top of the list is the little red line that you see here. Everybody that we spoke with felt we should just follow the rules for deceased donor kidneys, and we should give that kidney to the person at the top of the waiting list. And when we did that, we would be giving it to somebody who had a 38% chance of being Caucasian and a 34% chance of being African American. And so that was the fairest thing to do, just give it to the person who's at the top of the waiting list. The problem is you only helped one person. And so when you were done with that, the list was one shorter, but the person at the top of the list wasn't there anymore. We wanted to do something different, and because the allocation, so to speak, how we utilized a non-directed living donor kidney was not set in stone by federal policy, we decided that we would give that altruistic living donor kidney to somebody in the middle of the list. And all of these dark lines that you see here are people that have a willing but incompatible donor. They have to wait for a deceased donor kidney because they didn't have a compatible donor. So they're still on the waiting list, but they have a donor who could potentially pay it forward. So by giving it to somebody in the middle of the list, their donor could give it to somebody else on the list, whose donor could give it to somebody else on the list, and so on and so forth, until you created a very long chain of transplants. And the result of that is that you made the list significantly shorter, but the problem was that the person at the top of the list did not receive a kidney. So that left us in this challenge where we could think about giving the kidney to the person at the top of the waiting list with the deceased donor allocation, or we could follow the rules of the the rules of the non-simultaneous chain by giving it to somebody who wasn't in the middle of the list. The problem is that all these little dark lines have a 70% chance that they will be Caucasian and only a 13.5% chance that they will be African American. So the entire list is like about a little more than a third of the patients are African Americans, whereas only about 13% of the patients that are the thick line are African Americans. And so many people felt that it wasn't fair to allocate a kidney just to the thick lines, because only 13%, 12.5% as you see here, would be African American. I'd like to now try to convince you that that's only part of the story. So let's imagine that the dark green circles that we see here in the deceased donor pool represent the African Americans on the deceased donor waiting list. And again, the dark green lines here are the people that have a willing but incompatible donor as part of a living donor pool. Now, if we had 10 living non-directed donor kidneys, if we gave them to the deceased donor pool, we'd have a 34% chance we'd be giving them to an African American. We could pick another group that we want to prioritize, like blood type O patients or children or patients who are highly sensitized. The concept works, but for the purposes of this example, I'm going to use African Americans. Whereas if we gave to the pool in the living donor space, only 12.5% of patients would be African American. So let's actually play this out and see what happens when we give a kidney to either of these pools. So let's start with the deceased donor pool. If we gave these 10 kidneys to the deceased donor pool, we'd produce 10 transplants, and 3 of those transplants would go into an African American. If alternatively we gave these 10 kidneys to the living donor pool, each of those chains produces about 5 transplants in our experience per non-directed donor kidney. And so that's 50 transplants, and you can see that there are many more people transplanted. But more importantly, you transplant 3 of the desired group, in this case African Americans, if you do give it to the deceased donor pool, but you can transplant 6 of the desired group if you go through the knee chain concept. So we now believe that this differential allows us to show how we can achieve both equity and utility by giving some of these kidneys from the deceased donor pool to the living donor pool, and we believe that that's what should take place. And while only a very limited number of pilot programs have happened in the United States, I'm pleased to report that in Europe, Lucrezia Furian and her colleagues in Italy have now made this more commonplace and are working to make it the standard of care and are showing the benefits that can result when this happens. The next concept I'd like to talk with the group about is global kidney exchange. You can see we've had a number of collaborators. We've actually worked with 20 transplant centers across the world. But let's just take a very simple example. Let's imagine that we could do kidney exchange between Europe and the United States. So we'd have patients facing immunological barriers in both countries. In both countries, if we don't transplant those patients through a kidney exchange, they're going to remain on dialysis. But kidney exchange allows us to help 2 patients get a better quality of life and 2 donors to give that quality of life to the people that they love and to somebody else, if it was a simple 2-way exchange. The challenge here is, of course, is that the cost of transplantation in the United States is about twice the cost of transplantation in Europe. So how do we go about paying for this? Well, as I mentioned, we've had a great deal of experience about trying to work with different payers. And the truth is that either of these countries could pay for both transplants and still save money over the long run compared to having the recipients just stay on dialysis. And this gave us the idea that perhaps we could use the mechanism of kidney exchange to overcome financial barriers faced by patients in the world, because 2 to 7 million people around the world die because they cannot afford dialysis or transplantation. Yet many of those patients have a willing living donor, and perhaps kidney exchange could be a mechanism in some cases to save some of their lives. In that case, it would look something like this. Imagine that we had a patient and their related willing living donor in a low and middle income country. And in a high income country like the United States, we had a patient facing an immunological barrier. Without transplantation, the recipient in the international low and middle income country would die without transplantation or dialysis, whereas in the high income country, the patient would remain on dialysis, where the cost of dialysis is 3 times the cost of a kidney transplant over 3 to 5 years. And so we asked the question, how could we redeploy that 3x of spend to try to achieve a better outcome? And what you can see here is one of the X's could be used to pay for the transplant and long-term care of the patient in the high-income country. One of the X's could be used to provide long-term savings to the healthcare payer, and one of the X's could be used to pay for the transplantation and long-term care of the international patient. So by doing this, the international patient could give to the low and middle income country patient could give to the high-income recipient. The high-income country's donor could give to the low and middle income patient's recipient. And the high-income country's healthcare payer could pay for all of this and still reap long-term savings. The beauty of this is that everybody wins. The patients get better long-term outcomes, and both countries' healthcare payers, at least the high-income country payer, gets lower care. And hopefully we can begin creating an infrastructure in the low and middle income countries where they can see the benefit of offering this service to their patients. We first published this in AJT. There was a corresponding editorial by Alex Weissman and John Gill expressing some ethical concerns about the idea. We responded to those ethical concerns in a follow-up paper. And then Peter Singer, perhaps one of the most famous living philosophers, and his colleagues wrote an article in Lancet talking about the benefits of global kidney exchange, which was followed by a paper in ESOT by the authors you see here, and you'll hear about this next from Frederike, and we then responded to that. One of the beautiful things that's come out of this idea of kidney exchange is that HLA is different according to different ethnicities, and these turns out that we believe these differences are mutually beneficial to us. When we put people that are sensitized against one set of HLA and mix them with people who have different types of HLA, we believe we are beginning to see how those two things can come together for their mutual benefit. And so while it always seems impossible, that's only the case until it's done. Thank you very much.
Mike, thank you very much indeed. That was a very thought-provoking talk. Can I remind people to use the Q&A button to put your questions in, which we'll put to the panelists at the end of the session. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Frederike Ambagtsheer, if I've said that properly. She's well known to many of us and has a long-standing interest in the ethical and legal aspects of kidney exchange, which she's going to talk about now. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Nephrology and Transplantation in Erasmus. So Frederike, thank you.
Thank you, Nizam, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. I'm very pleased to give this talk, and I have no conflicts of interest to declare. I would also like to stress that this presentation is based on a publication that was also now just mentioned by Dr. Rees, which was published in Transplant International last year. And I would like to emphasize that the views and argumentations that I will be presenting are based on the views that are expressed in this paper by myself and by my co-authors, whom you see listed here, and do not represent the opinions of LPAT or ESOT as a whole. So yeah, the objective of this presentation is to review the concerns that have been raised against global kidney exchange, but also to discuss its potential merits by providing an overview of the ethical, legal, and psychosocial considerations. Now let's look at the critique that has been given against global kidney exchange. First of all, it is claimed that it violates the principle of non-payment for organs. Second, it has been claimed that it constitutes organ trafficking, that it is exploitative and coercive, that it may be undermined by corruption, that it does not guarantee proper care for living donors and recipients, especially those residing in low to middle income countries, and that it detracts countries from becoming self-sufficient. Now, amongst others, this critique has been given by the World Health Organization and by the Declaration of Istanbul Custodian Group. And because of time, I will only focus on the first 5 arguments. On the other hand, there's also been support given of global kidney exchange. Michael already mentioned Peter Singer's article in The Lancet, but also the American Society of Transplant Surgeons has stated that it supports efforts by the global transplant community to increase access to transplant care through through cross-border kidney exchanges. So now let's look at the first question. Does global kidney exchange violate the non-payment principle? And for this, first of all, it is important to look at what exactly this payment entails. And in global kidney exchange, the payment is given by the Alliance for Paired Kidney Donation, which is a funding for a kidney transplant procedure, specifically the cost of surgery and related medical treatment through an escrow fund to recipients from a low to middle income country. And this funding is given in exchange for a living donor who then facilitates a chain of transplants in high income countries. Now, the non-payment principle means that the human body and its parts shall not give rise to financial gain or comparable advantage. And this is a legal principle that has been codified into both national and international legislation, basically meaning that we're not allowed to buy or sell our organs or act as an intermediary between buyers and sellers. In conjunction, though, with this principle, there is widespread recognition of the fact that this prohibition does not preclude reimbursing medical costs incurred by the donor or other costs such as the loss of income. It's the World Health Organization, amongst others, who states this important principle. And this should be understood in the context of the overarching aim to remove financial disincentives to living organ donation in order to increase living organ donation rates. So given these considerations, we find it highly doubtful that global kidney exchange violates the non-payment principle. Rather, we anticipate that if lawyers or perhaps even judges would assess global kidney exchange legally, they would do so in light of the transplant community's broader aim to remove disincentives to organ donation and increase accessibility to transplantation, which we believe is also one of the merits of global kidney exchange. Now let's look at the second claim, the question whether global kidney exchange constitutes organ trafficking. And this, of course, is all a matter of definition. Now, there is no universally agreed upon definition of organ trafficking. Instead, the Council of Europe, in its latest convention against organ trafficking, lists a number of activities that, according to them, are to be seen as organ trafficking. And this list is also seen in the revised Declaration of Istanbul from 2018. Now, the Council of Europe Convention is an internationally binding and legally binding convention. Now, let's look at paragraph 3 here, which is relevant for this analysis, where it is stated that the removal of an organ from a living donor, whether donor has been offered or has received a financial gain or a comparable advantage in exchange for the removal of the organ, that, according to the Council of Europe, would constitute organ trafficking. Now, this, of course, raises the question what we define under a comparable advantage. Now, the Council of Europe has also released a number of guiding documents and handbooks in which it explains and further clarifies these concepts. And here you can see that comparable advantage is defined as any advantage that is comparable to a financial gain, which includes benefits in kind, such as a holiday, a car, a tuition fee, a job or promotion, or a settlement of debt. This same handbook also explicitly states that arrangements for paired or pool donation are not considered a comparable advantage. So we conclude that also in light of these considerations, it is unlikely that global kidney exchange would constitute organ trafficking. Now let's look at the third claim, the question whether global kidney exchange is exploitative and coercive. And of course, again, this is a matter of definition. And the United Nations has, in the context of its international conventions prohibiting human trafficking, but also organ trafficking, has attempted to create a definition of exploitation. However, it could not achieve international consensus. As a result of this, it left key elements of what would constitute exploitation intentionally vague. However, the consequence has been that advocates now increasingly recast transactions with the poor and the vulnerable as exploitation and or trafficking or slavery. And this is obviously not what the drafters of the UN conventions intended. Now, if you look at state practice, if you look at how judges or prosecutors define exploitation nationally in their national cases in the context of trafficking crimes, which would also include human and organ trafficking, you can see that there is some consensus there because they define exploitation very often in terms of a person owning somebody else, having ownership over someone, but also executing physical force, misleading people, deceiving people, giving them false information. And based on this, it is quite clear that global kidney exchange would not pass this exploitation threshold. In fact, in global kidney exchange, as Michael Rees also presented, there is a win-win situation for both donors and recipients. Now, of course, there is always a risk that a donor is exploited or coerced. However, this does not apply specifically to global kidney exchange or even to low to middle income countries. This applies to living donation more generally in all countries for which safeguards and procedures already have been put in place. Now, the most sensitive question perhaps to address is whether global kidney exchange is undermined by corruption. Now, let me be clear, corruption is a global problem. It exists in all countries, both low to middle income as well as high income countries. We also know that organ trade and corruption are interlinked and that organ trade also is a global problem existing in all corners of the world. However, we know based on empirical evidence that illegal transplants are more likely to take place in countries where governments simply have too many other challenges or priorities to enforce organ trafficking laws or crack down on black market abuses. It is in these countries where political and medical elites are closely connected, and we find that prosecutors are very reluctant to convict medical doctors, even when there is clear evidence of their involvement in organ trade. Now, paradoxically, the countries that are most likely to benefit from global kidney exchange are those who are the least likely to have safeguards in place to prevent corruption or illegal transplantations. It is for this reason that we advise that global kidney exchange should collaborate only with those centers that have a transparent and long-term track record of successful, legitimate transplantation and donation procedures. Now let's look at the final argument, the argument that global kidney exchange does not guarantee proper care for living donors and transplant recipients in low to middle income countries. Firstly, this is not an argument against global kidney exchange, but a critique of countries that lack appropriate conditions and safeguards for living donation registries and follow-up. In addition, high-income countries equally struggle to ensure that donors do not get lost to follow-up. And in fact, it is accepted practice in many countries to accept living kidney donors, usually relatives who travel from abroad, donate to their intended recipient, and then return to their home countries without guarantee that they will be receiving proper follow-up care. So to conclude, while some concerns about global kidney exchange are justified based on the available evidence, others are speculative or do not apply exclusively to global kidney exchange, but to living donation more generally. We also therefore recommend the implementation of safeguards, which would include at least the minimum, a list of minimum quality criteria for participating transplant centers and an international committee that independently oversees JKE's activities. Research, monitoring, and evaluation would provide the evidence-based data that we would need to give an empirical assessment of global kidney exchange. And we in particular encourage that in-depth interviews would be held with donors and recipients to get their views about how they find their participation in global kidney exchange. I would like to end with some discussion points. While global kidney exchange has great potential to reduce disparities and increase access to organ donation, some practical and logistic considerations perhaps remain, in particular in light of the current pandemic. So I would like to ask the question, is it feasible to expand and conduct global kidney exchange globally, also given the relatively low number that have been performed so far? And is it perhaps more practical or logistically easier to optimize national kidney exchange or conduct regional exchanges? I would like to end with a word of thanks to my co-authors, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Lisa. Now we are ready for the discussion. Do we have some questions from the auditorium?
There's a question, Franco, from Massimo Cardillo to Lisa, asking why should a compatible pair be included in a chain?
Oh, that's a very interesting point.
Yes, I saw that question. Thank you, Nizam. Mostly, I mean, to be honest, there isn't any reason why all compatible pairs couldn't go into the kidney exchange program, but I think we might logistically struggle with that. The main advantage is for a better HLA match or better age match. So for example, if you have a child or a young person whose only suitable living donor is their grandmother, they may choose to go in even though they're compatible to improve their age match. And we have achieved this in the scheme. And this is mutually beneficial because it's beneficial to them because they get a better age match, but it's also beneficial to other pairs in the pool because it propagates transplant opportunities within the same pool. So that's the main reason that people do it. I would like to see us in the future be able to develop our algorithm such that we could offer this to far more people and encourage far more compatible pairs to go in, and we could manage. Maybe we should do our whole living donor program through the sharing scheme. There would be a thought.
Thanks, Lisa. I've got a question for Frederike.
Question for Frederike.
Yeah. So you talked about coercion, and you said that coercion can occur in high-income countries and low-income countries, but is it not more likely to occur in low-income countries because the pressures are more significant?
Well, the problem is that we are not entirely sure whether that is indeed the case, because most research that has been done into coercion and exploitation has been performed in low to middle income countries, and we actually know very little about these factors in high income countries. So yes, while it is something that we are likely to expect that it occurs more often there, I am hesitant to say that it therefore is only a problem that would exist in low to middle income countries. And in fact, we also know from, and this is just based on conversations with transplant professionals in high income countries, that they are also able to name examples of suspicions in their center where donors and recipients were reporting such issues. If that answers your question.
Okay, yeah, no, fair points, thank you. Franco?
I have a question to Peter. Peter, from your analysis in the European different countries, what do you think are the major difficulties in having a common European program?
Thank you for the question.
Which will solve a lot of problems.
Yeah. So if you see already, you know,
it's difficult to hear you. Can
you hear me now?
A little bit better.
Okay. So if we take, for instance, a Eurotransplant, it's already, you know, I'm afraid too hard to find a common denominator in their policies, since in the largest country, Germany, per donation is not allowed by law. So that's one reason why it's actually hard to have international exchanges, because the local regulations are so different. But there are some promising moves. As I mentioned, Scandinavian Transplant could start their program, and I think the joint software that we are going to develop can also help, because we will work together on that software with colleagues like Lisa and Bernadette and others, and we will try to integrate all the aspects, both policy and clinical, which are relevant. So hopefully this software can also help facilitating international exchanges. But as I told, there is also a need to get convergence in legislation.
But are you optimistic or not?
I mean, it's very hard to tell about Germany, so sometimes we hear good news.
But without Germany, all the other different...
I know I'm optimistic actually, because everybody in this community, in this network, see clearly the benefits of joining pools, especially for the hard to match patients. It's obvious that together it can produce more transplants, and that's the main goal. But on the other hand, it should be realistic and step by step. So I also agree that perhaps that's a good way first to enlarge the regional collaborations, and not to jump into a European scheme, but steps to step enlarge these collaborations, have the platform, software and regulation, and also some organization who is actually taking care of such a program. So that's also a big question. What kind of organization would take care of this program? So hopefully we will have somebody to step in and lead this initiative.
Thanks, Peter.
Franco, I think Lisa maybe wants to make a point.
I was only just going to comment that it's also, I think, Peter, isn't it true that one size doesn't fit all? So actually what would suit collaboration or a mutual aid between similar sized countries may not work where you've got a very large scheme or a much smaller scheme wishing to join, but there are different models that we have suggested that could be adopted by different countries in different ways. And I think the key is flexibility. It's allowing innovation within a framework, and even if countries have different legal frameworks and different ethical policies and so on, that if you come to a memorandum of understanding between those countries about how they'll work together, that's absolutely critical.
Can I ask a question, if I may, of Mike? So fascinating talk, Mike, and you presented a very convincing case. What proportion of deceased donors then do you think should be used in this way?
Well, we've actually just published a paper in AJT where we looked at using deceased donor kidneys to come into the pool and they were forced immediately to go out. So you could only go give it to one person, and then their donor gave immediately back to the waiting list. And we used 2 years of data in the United States. And, you know, there's lots of different ways that you could simulate it, but it could produce 500 to 700 extra kidney transplants. So that means that we were using about 700 out of about 14,000 deceased donor kidneys for this program. We limited it to donors with KDPI between 20 and 35. So, I think we should try it with all deceased donors. If people, you know, if you have in the United States, if you have a 97% PRA, you don't get access to all the kidneys in the United States. But if you had a willing living donor who was willing to donate, perhaps that's a way that you could get access to all the kidneys in the United States, and you might take a riskier deceased donor kidney if it immunologically matched you. So my suggestion would be that we try it with all deceased donor kidneys for those who are willing to accept it in exchange for their living donor's kidney.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. So Franco, are we?
Just a question to Peter. No, to Michael. Michael, are you facing the same difficulty as Europe in doing a common US program for exchange kidney?
Yes, you're absolutely right, Franco. We are beginning a trial now in the United States of a partnership between MatchGrid and the Alliance for Paired Kidney Donation, where we're working together and trialing a new way of doing kidney exchange, where we try internal exchanges in big transplant centers that want to do internal exchanges, and then regional hubs where transplant centers can work together locally, so we don't have to be shipping across 3 time zones. And then for patients that aren't able to find a match internally or at the hub, across a national program. And the Alliance for Paired Kidney Donation is now working together with 15 countries. So we're happy to provide our software to any country that's interested in using it for their kidney exchange program. We're happy to work with them to modify the software to meet their specific needs, because I agree, Lisa, there needs to be flexibility. There's different strategies to make this work. And what I think we'll really benefit from is if we can all be on a common platform, or at least if we all agree on a common way of sharing data like we do in banking or in healthcare, then we could begin to work together in a more meaningful way. But you raise a great point, Franco, and I think the United States could do more transplants if we could all work together. But as I said in my talk, I think that one of the benefits of not working together is that it's created competition, and that competition has led to some wonderful innovations. Frankly, I'll step away when I think there's no more room to innovate in paired exchange, but I believe there is. I think there's lots of opportunity incorporating deceased donors' kidneys. And Lisa, I'm with you. I think that unless you've got a zero mismatch with your brother or sister, you probably ought to be participating in a kidney exchange to try to at least get a 0 DR, 0 DQ match, mismatch.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, yeah, I think we're coming to the end of our time now. So we're going to conduct a brief poll, which should appear on your screens. So can I encourage all the participants just to tick the boxes that should be appearing in front of you. And that'll just take a second, and then hopefully we'll have some answers. And while you're doing that, okay, so there we are. So 71% of you found it extremely useful. Nobody found it not useful. So I think that's been a successful hour. And remember, this webinar is really an introduction to what's going on at ESOT. So can I please encourage you to look at the ESOT program and to register, and hopefully come and join us in Milan at the end of August. Franco, over to you.
Thank you, Nizam. Thank you all for participating in the meeting, and I won't tell you that we have not lost anything, because in England and Germany are 0-0, so we had all the benefits. Ciao.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frederike.
Thank